Welcome to the 6th edition of the interview series hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice, the CoP. My name is Ria Ligari, CoP and Virtual Dialogue Consultant for the UN Women Training Center. I'm very honored to be joined today by Jean Kemitare, who will be speaking to us today about gender-based violence and training for gender equality. I'll begin by just explaining a little bit about what the CoP interview series is. So this series features a range of interviews with experts on topics related to training for gender equality. It runs from June through to December 2007, and we do 2017, sorry, and we do an interview every 2 weeks with an international expert. Each interview lasts about half an hour, and our listeners have the chance to ask questions by clicking on the questions tab on the right-hand side of the webinar platform at any time. So you can use that to send in your questions, and at the end of the interview, I'll be able to pose those to Jean on your behalf. So without further ado, let me introduce today's guest. Jean Kemitare is the Program Manager for the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Network at Raising Voices. She works in Uganda, and she coordinates over 450 network members. The network contributes to strengthening capacity and analysis and fosters cohesion and activism among activists and practitioners across Africa. Jean's work centers on advancing the empowerment of African women and contributing to a world where men and women are valued in equal measure. I should also mention that Raising Voices is an organization that works for the prevention of violence against women and children by catalyzing change in the nature of relationships between women, men, girls, boys, children, and adults. And before joining Raising Voices, Jean was involved in capacity building and advocacy for pro-poor policies with development, research, training, and action for development. So Jean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
We're very honored to have you here. And so I thought before we begin talking about your work at Raising Voices on gender-based violence, I wonder if we could discuss a little bit about your personal experience of training for gender equality. So I wondered, how did you become a gender trainer, and what prompted your interest in capacity building?
Yes, I started my career early on in a different field in the corporate world, but was really as a result of my history growing up experience, interested in gender issues. Then when the company I was working for closed in 2001, I worked in the Department of Women and Gender Studies of Makerere University as a program assistant. And that then began my journey on gender issues and gender analysis. During the same time, I joined a local membership organization called Action for Development, ACFOD, whose mandate is to work on gender equality and gender equity. And at that time, the approach the organization used was training women leaders, training women in different professions and fields in order to try and build women's agency and lead up to gender equality. So that's when I started my gender training journey. I moved on then to chronic poverty reduction work. Again, my primary role was capacity building, this time at community level, so a lot of training in the community and also with national NGOs whose members worked in community. Finally, I moved to Raising Voices, where since 2007, I've been involved with different aspects of training, facilitation, developing training content on gender-based violence. Primarily, the work I do involves coordinating the GBV network, as you have said, and among its activities over the years has been training individuals and organizations in different aspects of gender-based violence prevention.
Wonderful. And given your experience, why do you feel that training for gender equality is important for overcoming gender-based violence? By that I mean, how do you think training can help us address violence against women or against children?
Yes, I think training is really a critical element of strategies to address violence against women all over the world. I know we might have a bit of fatigue over expenses spent in training, but I still think it's a critical strategy for gender-based violence prevention. First, it helps to creating basic awareness. Different groups receive in-depth knowledge building by attending trainings. It's one thing to put out campaigns with information around gender-based violence. It's another to deep knowledge of gender-based violence, causes, consequences, types, etc. through training. Because you realize that many of the issues we are trying to address in preventing gender-based violence, we have been socialized in, and we take those as normal. So I think training helps to build knowledge in a special way. In addition, training helps to build different technical skills for GBV prevention response among activists and practitioners that are addressing GBV in the different types of work that they do. Training also helps, more importantly, really, to build political consciousness. And this, to me, I see as moving beyond having technical information, but looking at raising people's critical consciousness to see how the world is structured to perpetuate and maintain that 30% figure of violence that women experience, and also to help them come up with solutions that are sustainable to address structural drivers of violence against women and move beyond addressing contributory factors. So that is an important element of training. I also feel like training as a strategy helps in building women's agency, because there are particular trainings that I'm aware of that are women specific, and these create safer spaces for women to come together, enhance their self-awareness, self-esteem, increase their awareness of the world around them and how it perpetuates systemic oppression, build their own power within for addressing that oppression. And for us here, really, training is not just a one-off activity, it's a process over time to translate knowledge into action and behavior change.
I think that's an excellent point. I think you make a very strong case for the value of training, especially for gender-based violence prevention. And I think especially what you said about critical consciousness, raising critical consciousness and agency, and taking a more systemic and long-term approach is, I think, very, very important. So drawing on that, then, if we turn to your work at Raising Voices, which I've read a little bit about and is very inspirational, I'd like to hear maybe a little bit about the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Network. How does the network operate, and what's the rationale behind it? What are its objectives? And how do you work to coordinate so many members? Because, as I said, you have 450 members or even more. And how do you work with them to promote activism?
Yeah, Raising Voices, as you introduced in the beginning, works to prevent violence against women and children. And our work is in three broad areas of work. One is the practice, where we have methodologies designed to for primary prevention, community mobilization methodologies for primary prevention of violence against women and children. And we provide technical support to organizations using those methodologies somehow to enhance the practice of doing the work. We then have a learning area of work where we learn and evaluate the methodologies we're implementing, the work we are doing with partners in the community to see really what works for preventing violence against women, what's effective, what's not. We then have the influencing area of work to share our learning and to learn together with the broader field to enhance and change thought, analysis, and practice around violence against women prevention. So the GBV Prevention Network is a loose affiliation coming together of activists and practitioners in the field of violence against women prevention and response, aimed at increasing momentum for violence against women prevention and response. And its work lies within the influencing area that I talked about. We, yes, have more than 450 individual and organizational members. And these are people and organizations interested in addressing violence against women across the continent and some even beyond the continent. However, those that are outside the Horn, East and Southern Africa, which is the area of focus for this network, are considered as friends. We have an advisory committee that has individuals that are geographically and thematically spread across the region, and their role is to provide strategic guidance to the work of the network. We also have thematic action groups that are a semi-autonomous collective of members interested in building their capacity and taking their action in different areas, maybe research, development of education materials, addressing GBV in emergencies, and that kind of thing. The network exists to create a common analysis of violence against women based on rights-based principles. And this goes back to what you talked about, the critical consciousness. Would like really to have people that are members, organizations that are members, have a common analysis of violence against women that's really based on feminist rights-based principles across the region. In addition, we seek to increase solidarity and connection among people doing this work because, with the nature of funding, connection and sharing becomes harder. And we seek to bring together, people doing this work because it can only get stronger if we have more solidarity and connection. We also work to foster activism among individuals. So individuals are doing personal activism, but also among organizations so that we have much more collective activism. Because we are spread across a large geographical area, we have a number of activities that we have designed to create change at different levels, individual level, organizational level, and broader collectives. We balance between online engagement and interpersonal engagement, obviously, because of the expense of bringing people together. But we recognize the importance of interpersonal engagement, which really is the trainings and processes where we facilitate critical consciousness. So we have engagements with our members on social media, putting out the same rights-based perspective of violence against women, engaging with them and encouraging online and offline activism through that platform. But we also have other political consciousness raising processes. We have trainings. Like in a number of cities, raising processes. Then we also have trainings by the thematic action groups on different technical aspects of the work. Then we also have interpersonal process called introspective process for organizations called Get Moving, which previously we used to encourage organizations to have a facilitator from within and facilitate, but we have more recently started doing this facilitation ourselves. So we engage with an organization and have a 5-day process and then have follow-up processes, again, for increasing not only technical knowledge, but enhancing critical consciousness. We also have other activities like the 16 days campaign, which really are meant to heighten actions taken during that period. We create toolkits for organizations. We have so many other activities, like activities that bring together individuals through our sister-to-sister program, where we pair women from different countries to meet online once a month, over 6 months, and follow a kind of manual with reading prompts and journaling prompts for them to increase their knowledge and again their own critical consciousness. So yes, that is about the GBV prevention network.
That's wonderful. I think the work sounds incredibly inspiring, and I think it really reflects what I was reading on Raising Voices website, which is a real sort of participatory approach to activism and capacity strengthening, and just this focus on critical consciousness and solidarity. I think I read a quote by one of your colleagues which said that I thought activism was moving around with a placard and shouting. Now I know that I can do activism in many small ways, in how I treat others and how I treat my house helper or children. Activism doesn't have to be something big. Small things mean a lot. So I found that very, very inspiring and very related to what you were just talking about. And I wonder if, how do you then, as a staff member at Raising Voices, how do you and your colleagues put these inclusive, participatory values into practice when you're undertaking these capacity strengthening initiatives?
Yeah, first of all, as an organization, we invest a lot in processes to help those of us that are staff connect with the issues, because we know that change starts with you, the individual. And for us who are working on these issues, we know that we need to continually reflect not just on the technical aspects, but also the political aspects of this work, systems of oppression that maintain the gender inequality that leads to violence against women and so many other things. So first and foremost, we have processes and other support mechanisms for staff. Turning to our capacity strengthening initiatives, we aim for positive and aspirational processes that will really foster activism and create change and help people to think critically about these issues. We're deliberate to begin with around how we set up the space in order to create a safe space for the process, which will encourage participants to bring their whole self in the process. For example, a small thing like beginning with the way we set ground rules, we base these on the ethics of the work, like confidentiality, non-judgment, have people discuss all these ethics and come up with ground rules for the process. But then also things like how we set up the space. We ensure that the layout of the sitting layout doesn't reflect the power hierarchies that are part and parcel of patriarchy, which is really at the roots of violence against women or gender-based violence. We set up the room and materials on display on the walls, on display tables, in many different places, materials that are intended to inspire a different and equitable way of thought and practice. So throughout the process, participants are also engaging with these materials. We also develop content and process that is based on knowledge of the particular participants that are coming to this process and what's contextually relevant to them. Because this work is really rooted in the norms, different social norms that we all have been socialized in, and perpetuate violence or experiencing violence or remaining silent around violence. We use a process that's participatory, as you said, and we are deliberate about this. First of all, we have different mix of techniques that appeal to different types of learning. For example, we have highly interactive PowerPoints, group work, and so many different ways of learning. We ensure also to make the process fun, but while ensuring that we facilitate critical reflection, self-discovery for people rather than dictating to participants. We engage with a lot of questions, reflections, and journaling throughout the process. And of course, as trainers, co-trainers, a team of trainers, we make sure we role model the values that we espouse as an organization throughout the process and the values that are fundamental to the work of addressing violence against women.
I think that's a wonderful and very motivational. I think this approach, this participatory approach, and really embodying the principles and the ethics that the organization represents and espouses. I think it's a very important thing for trainers to very consciously ensure that one another and themselves reflect these values, as you said, like these feminist values of training. And but based on this, I wonder if you have, you could tell us a little bit about a, sort of motivational story from your training experiences. For example, when you have experienced or witnessed change in participants or in yourself as a trainer through an experience of this kind of capacity strengthening.
Yes, I'll start with myself. As you train and discuss these issues, you engage with different people from different contexts and different ways of thinking about looking at the world, and that expands your own thinking. Whereas you might have started off being in a certain box, that kind of going through these processes, even as a facilitator, expands your own thinking and makes you learn a lot. And I've engaged with different groups, different maybe let me say minority groups, and that has really acceptance, my recognition of human rights. Not that I didn't know them before, but I said expanded and deepened and strengthened. Also small things like, because we talk a lot about power, our content is based a lot on power. And that has helped me think a lot about relationships, including relationships with my children. I think that has been the biggest personal transformation. Now, turning away from me to training, there are so many stories of change. One of the recent stories I have is a kind of turning point for me, because as how in most processes, most training, there's that 1, 2, 3 quote unquote difficult participant. Yes. The one who always seems to have a very different view and wants to take the whole group on a different tangent. And there are many ways you are trained
Oh dear, we seem to have a connection issue.
Huge transformation. Hello?
I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm so sorry. We had a small connection issue, but now it's back. I'm so sorry. Please continue.
Yeah.
Your story is very wonderful.
Yeah, so these two individuals seem to be the most difficult, but then towards the end, they start sharing their own transformation. One man actually went and discussed power issues with his family, with his wife, was surprised that the wife didn't think he was quite as equitable as he thought, and had a lot of reflections and promise and, actions he put forth that, I'm going to do this and this different, I'm going to do that and that different. And I was really taken aback. Same thing with the female participant who completely transformed, and, you meet her and she's this very different person. And that really made me reflect on sometimes maybe we need to be a bit patient with some of that type of participant.
I agree.
Because they are going through their own process of change. And it's hard for them to process, and maybe that's why they are lashing out like that. Of course, there are those who are just totally not going to change, but some of them are actually trying to work through their own process of change. And how that is a reflection I've been having.
I think that's a wonderful reflection to have, and a very, very telling one, I think, about these resistances, that they can manifest in different ways. And sometimes, a participant in a training may not be affected by the training and may just, reject outright what they're being surrounded by. But others, I think you're right. I think the vast majority are really going through their own processes of transformation. And I think each individual has their own individual process of this. So I think I agree. I'm with you when you say that we need to have patience and to allow everyone to have their own, trajectory of change and transformation. I think these are very inspiring stories. And we have a question here.
And to recognize that trajectory is different for different people.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, I agree. I think there's no two training participants who are the same, and there's no two processes of transformation which will be the same. So I think, yes, I think you make a very good case for giving everyone their space and their time to go through these processes of change. And we have a question here from one of our listeners called Konate Philippe. And he wants to know a little bit more about gender-based violence in Africa. He wanted to know if there is a similarity between Uganda and the rest of West Africa regarding gender-based violence.
Yes, there is global similarity of gender-based violence, in that in most cases, not in most cases, gender-based violence really is rooted in power imbalance between women and men, or gender inequality, which is prevalent across the globe. Across the globe, we have not yet come to 50-50 gender equality, if I may use that term, and therefore violence against women or gender-based violence exists across the globe. However, there are differences that are brought about as a result of different contextual factors. And we know, research has proven that there are different contributory factors that may differ from context to context, that may make a particular context have higher prevalence of violence than another. For example, education level, the general economic development of the population, laws, the effectiveness of laws and other structures at broader level. All those cause differentials in different contexts and make some contexts have a much higher prevalence than others. However, and to respond to Felipe directly, I think Uganda is pretty much like the rest of West Africa. We have 22% rate of sexual violence. We have around 57% women experiencing physical violence from their partners. That is research from the Demographic and Health Survey. And I think those figures are quite similar in West Africa because we have similar contextual issues, dominant social norms that really have rigid gender attitudes. We have same challenges around economic strife, same challenges around the education of women and men, and all that. So I do believe the context in terms of GBV is similar.
I think, yes, that sounds like a very good explanation, because I think if countries have these similar factors, then I think, yes, GBV probably manifests in very similar ways. And I think this is related to another question we've received from one of our listeners called Tim Carpentier. And he'd like to know if you could please elaborate on different approaches to implementing GBV training or capacity building across different contexts, by which he means humanitarian contexts or development contexts or sudden onset crisis or rural and urban settings, which I think is related to this idea of really contextualizing training. And as you said, because obviously in different contexts it would be quite different, the training that you might have to implement. So I wonder if you could respond maybe to his question as well.
Yeah, it's good that he has broken down the categories, because as you say, it is really important to contextualize, because we're not just imparting knowledge, for example, on washing hands is healthy for you, which is the same in a humanitarian context, same in a development context, same in a rural and in an urban. This, we are asking people to see the social norms they hold dear differently, and to do something, to look at women as having same worth and value as men, and therefore not deserving of violence. yet we've been socialized differently. I think in a humanitarian context, the way you then do that is different, because we are talking about long-term training and processes and facilitation. A humanitarian context is quite volatile. I don't know that you have that much time for that kind of thing. You then might need to focus on some other aspects of that training, because we have movement in and out, whereas we have camps that have have existed for 20 years, but most of the time the humanitarian context is mobile, it changes. And so the way you tailor this training might focus a bit more on knowledge and awareness of services, then awareness of causes, consequences, and might be a bit less of long-term transformative, although you can incorporate that in that kind of training. Then for a development context, then that would be a bit different. But the good thing is a lot of times humanitarian contexts then evolve from crisis to development stage. And if you're committed to the context or to the work, you can also evolve the trainings like that. The same thing for rural and urban. Reading literacy levels will be different. So if you're going to use materials, are you using more of images or text? Those are things you put into consideration. The language, even in the urban, language varies depending on the type of education that has been received. So the type of language you use in materials for the training would have to be different. Yeah, I hope I've answered Tim's question.
Very much so. I think it's very true that you have to really know your audience and tailor training accordingly across all these settings. And this brings me to another question that is posed by Hadia Nusrat, who I think is writing to us from Afghanistan. And she asked the question that you touched on slightly before, that and our COP series has touched on it several times, the idea that, you know, donors and essentially governments and everything are now somehow a bit averse sometimes to spending money on training, as you said in the beginning, that you know, funding is always an issue. And she wondered how can you, you know, retain this commitment? Have you encountered this kind of resistance whereby, you know, donors or funders or whoever is not interested really in spending money on training? And if so, how have you advocated to bring the discussion back to a commitment to transformation before things like service delivery or before things, you know?
Yeah, that is a problem. It's true. And, you know, I think globally that's being encountered, fatigue with training. And this, I think, goes with the wave of the demand for evidence. And as you can imagine, how to document and produce concise indicators on individual transformation and how that transformation then translates into drop of prevalence of violence against women in a particular area is not easy.
Yes.
So that's where the pressure is coming from. It's not something easy to measure, and people have got to report tangibly on the change they are creating, and attributing trainings to drop in prevalence is not as easy. Our whole learning and influencing area of work has that as part of the agenda, advocating for evidence to be seen in a different way and not just highly rigorous RCTs. And also our influencing area of work has a global influencing piece that is advocating around those issues. But I think to answer Hadia, yes, that's a question that, I mean, that's a challenge that's being felt across the globe, especially with increasing demand for scientific and rigorous evidence around prevention of or gender-based violence prevention.
I think
we probably need to get creative around attributing that kind of change and explaining in detail our theories of change, how this training will change this individual, will change this group, and then will lead to this kind of change at systemic level. And that, yeah.
I agree. I think it can't be approached as such a rigid kind of way, because we can't really demonstrate individual transformation in this way, especially when, there's such a short period of time for training. I mean, if you have a 5-day training, how are you supposed to attribute, a decline in tangible violence to that? But I agree. I think we have to get creative with this. And that ties into another question that Hadia is asking, which I think is a bit of a trickier question. She asks whether if you have ever dealt with GBV in an interface context where religion is said to give men more power, and therefore they exercise more power, and equality can sometimes become difficult to debate. So she wonders how you have handled or would handle that kind of situation.
Yeah, the context we're in is a little bit similar to hers, although hers might have a little bit much more influence of religion, but we also do have religion as a huge influence in people's thought, actions, attitudes, or just what I think is right, even or what I think others think is right, even if I may not think it's right, and I go with that. And as you know, our holy books, scriptures, so this context is dominated by Christianity and Islam. And the holy books really teach submission, teach, all that. And their teachings are nestled in patriarchy, really. And which I could say, is fertile ground for violence and silence around violence. And Raising Voices has adapted its methodology on preventing violence against women, called SASA, to Christian and Muslim faith communities. We have a piece called a methodology called SASA Faith that we then try to base the discussion on the basic values of religion, peace, justice, and all that, to bring discussions to, if I'm going to use Christian examples, if you are talking about submission, but the next verse is talking about Christ loving the church and wash the church's feet. So using the same doctrines within the holy books to bring out the issue of us all being of equal worth and value, and issue of justice, peace, and all that is an approach that's that has been piloted by Raising Voices and Troke in a bid to deal with that issue of religion, because it is a serious issue here, and I think in Hadia's context is serious too. So if she could maybe write to info@raisingvoices.org to get more information and possibly get that SASA faith methodology.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for letting her know. So Hadia, I hope you will write to, she says, thanks, will do. So Hadia will be in touch, I think. And I think that's a very strong and very positive a take on it. And I think that kind of methodology is very useful and will be very useful for many of our stakeholders at the COP and just people around the world, because that, as you said, is a very serious question. And I think training is a very positive way of, with this kind of methodology to take forward the idea of transformation, and not to work against religion necessarily, but to work within these contexts. And
exactly.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jean. I think this has been such a wonderful interview and so rich in your insights, and I think we've learned a lot from everything that you've said. And we hope that you'll be able to join us maybe on the discussion forum of the COP later on, and we'll be posting this recording on our YouTube channel with great pleasure. And we hope that many more people will be able to listen to it there. And thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your wonderful insights with us today.
Thank you, Ria. Thank you so much. It was an honor for me to be here. I'll join the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's our great privilege. And so thank you very much for all of us who have joined us today. And I hope many more people will listen to this on YouTube. And I'm going to close the recording now, which means it'll stop very abruptly. But I just want to say thank you very much to you, to Jean, to everyone who's listened. And I wish you all a very wonderful day. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.